Hi, it's good to see you. Today we get to discuss a mass communication theory, which is just, I know I say this every time, but this one is really, really fascinating. And as I was reviewing my notes for today, I have to admit, the more I was reviewing, the more I began doing new research because mass communication really is what is the here and now and what you are most familiar with. And I have to admit, I spent 4 hours just reading and looking at more things right before I really thought I was going to be recording about 4 hours ago. But as I was reviewing my notes, this is a fascinating topic. And for those of you who are interested in media marketing, pay a special attention today, and I hope that again the concepts you hear just really push you forward into doing more of your own research, more of your own study. I get just a small amount of time to be able to go over this with you, but this is absolutely a fascinating topic. All right? Hope you find it as enjoyable as I did because the mass media really is impacting our society. So, as we go on, we have to ask ourselves, well, if mass media is here and now, why is it important to study the history? I mean, can't we just look at this year and what's occurring right now? Yes, we can, but if history repeats itself, as we know it does, then I think there is great wisdom in just in looking at the progression of media through the years, how it has impacted communication, how it has impacted society, and then what are the lessons that can be learned? Because there are great lessons that can be learned, both from media uh, failures and things that have been done very, very well by the media. All right, so first of all, we want to recognize, number one, that if we study it, it helps us understand the role of media as we study mass media, that which impacts the entire globe. And the reason we want to look at that, notice on the slide it says, how does our society differ from an oral society? And you say, well, Mrs. Morris, aren't we an oral society? To which I would say no. I'm going to take just a second and pause with you. What is an oral society? An oral society is that kind of society in which everything is passed down by the mouth. All right, when we went back into the era before there was communication that was written, before there were books, and people, or you had cultures that were completely illiterate. So you would have the great grandfather telling the grandfather something, and then the grandfather would turn around and tell the father something, and the father would turn around and tell the child something. And so what you had were these generations of knowledge, but the knowledge was passed merely by the mouth, merely by that which was spoken. Well, obviously, we don't have that kind of a society. Though we do communicate with the mouth, we have an awful lot of texting, right? And twittering and things like that. And so we have a vastly different society simply from that antiquated society, which is an oral society. And believe it or not, there are still some oral communities around the globe, pockets where literacy is still not very strong and where these people do most of their communication via talking. Next, we want to recognize that if we study the history of mass comm, it helps us to learn to be more discerning about what we really do know about our world. You know, I'll tell my college students who come to Maranatha, I like to give them quick updates in class about current events, and some of them will say to me, "Oh, Mrs. Morris, I just didn't have time to pick up a newspaper. I didn't have time to read a magazine." And I say, "All right, but how much time did you spend on Facebook?" Because if you were on Facebook for 10 minutes, then you had 10 minutes to go to foxnews.com and find out what's going on in the world. And we need to learn to be discerning. What do we know about our world? What is happening? Why is it that some of these United Arab countries are now saying that they are going to ban the use of, um, like blackberries in their country? What's the issue there? What do you know about what's going on globally around you? So let's just take a really brief one slide overview of some big major issues, all right? First of all, we have to recognize, looking back at some of our previous conversations, that we had World War I. Remember that? Some of the war propaganda that was used and the awareness of how the mass media could be used to impact, societies and what they believed about what was going on in the war and what they believed about the enemy. Then we moved on to the 1930s, where Franklin Roosevelt began his effective use of fireside chats. And it's interesting because some historians believe that that initial fireside chat was really almost by accident, that Roosevelt wasn't feeling well. Some history books will tell you. And so his doctor really wanted him to not go too far away or outside. And so he simply stayed by the fireside to keep him warm. But that gave the aura, it gave the essence of just a president who was in his home, who was comfortable, and it just exploded in popularity as far as Roosevelt was concerned. Then we were moved on to 1938. We've already had a discussion, right, of the War of the Worlds and the panic that that caused. Then again in 1940, and we're taking some pretty big leaps, but I'm looking at some pretty big historical chunks, where we had World War II and war propaganda, the anti-Hitler propaganda that was used. Now I'm going to jump ahead to the 1960s. Now, this was really the first war in which you'll find books that say the war was brought into the living rooms of Americans. In other words, you had some of those embedded journalists for the first time, and you would see our boys coming back on stretchers, and we would see the horrificness of war and the broken bodies, and we would see the dead bodies of the soldiers who had given their lives, and that was very, very um, disturbing to a lot of Americans. And that was how mass media impacted us during the Vietnam War. Then jump ahead to 1989 and the Exxon Valdez. Now we're going to park there for just a minute. And let me ask you this. What do you know about the Exxon Valdez? And let me say this, for those of you who are interested in going into media and maybe media marketing, you need to really do some serious study. You find a lot of communication books nowadays that will look at the Exxon Valdez as just the epitome of a PR disaster, an initial one. Okay, there have been many through the years, but this was just huge, just huge. So let's talk about it for just a little bit. The Exxon Valdez was a tanker ship, obviously oil, that did $2.5 billion of damage, and the estimates were that it dumped somewhere between 10.8, you've got some who estimate all the way up to perhaps 20, maybe 30 million gallons of oil. Now, this wasn't necessarily the largest, if you go do research, this wasn't necessarily the largest amount of oil that had ever been um, spilled in such a way. But the issue was the location, right? So if you look at this map and notice this is the Gulf of Alaska and the Exxon Valdez, if this were a little bit bigger, you'd be able to see how far down, you can go look this up for yourself, okay, the flow of the oil went. But one of the issues was that this was just such a dangerous situation that it was not an accessible area. It was very difficult for helicopters. It was very difficult for the Coast Guard. It was a terribly, terribly challenging spill to try to, encapsulate and to try to fix because of its location. Now, because of its location being way up there, and of course, if you go and do your research, um, from most accounts, what happened was the captain, for whatever reason, handed over his ship to his second and third mate, were either too exhausted or had not received their mandatory hours of rest. Whatever the case was, you'll have some places say that their manuals, their directional manuals were not working at all, and this tanker ran aground, and it was awful. And Exxon Valdez, or Exxon, I'm sorry, the company initially tried to just say, well, it really doesn't matter. We're up here in this really remote area of Alaska. Nobody's going to really know what happened, and so they were pretty, quite frankly, hush-hush about it. But you had some environmentalists catch wind of what had happened. And you know what? They went out and they began taking pictures. And people were gravely concerned when these pictures of how the environment had been impacted began to hit. Back then, you didn't really have the internet as much, but you started having these in magazines and in newspapers and on the 6 o'clock news. And people were stunned and they were really outraged. What is this company? And at the time, Exxon was the #1 oil company in the world. Why is this company failing to try and fix the mistake? So let me show you a little progressional timeline here. First of all, we'll look at the response. Okay, so we want to think mass media, and again, a lot of this was print. But first of all, Exxon decided to handle the criticism with no outside public relation consultants. And you know what? They may be very good at oil, and they may be very, very good at making money, but they were very poor at any kind of a public relations situation. Next, they ignored the criticism. Those who were saying, "Hey, there's an issue here," they just chose to ignore it. They dismissed the interest and the and involvement of the environmental activists. I think that we do need to take care of our globe. I think that God has given it to us to care for. I do think some people go excessive, and I do think that some people ignore the world the globe that God has given us. I think there has to be that happy medium, but Exxon chose to just completely ignore it. They said, "We don't care, we don't care." They refused to acknowledge the extent of the problem. That's what their lawyers suggested they do. They refused assistance from local residents and environmental volunteers. People who were there said, "Look, you can use our boats. We'll go out. We'll help you." And Exxon just kept saying, "It's really not a big deal." They also used the fear appeal. They predicted that there would be an increase, a major increase in gasoline prices if they had to really do all this cleanup instead of perhaps just kind of letting it settle into the ocean. And then the CEO of Exxon took 6 days to make any kind of a public formal statement. So you've got almost a week going by. And really, Exxon thought, no big deal. We have an oil spill. There have been oil spills in the past, and we're just going to let this go. And it completely blew up in their face, primarily because of the new impact of this mass media. And you started having cartoons like this one. You see the man in the hat with an Exxon hat on, helping the Eskimo smile, and the seal, which obviously the irony there is that the seals were losing their lives and were covered in oil, saying, "Do you think they're really cleaning up their act?" And the response from the other seal is, "It just seems to me they're cleaning up their ad." There was great, great outlash against Exxon. So then what happened? What did they decide to do in communication? Again, no designated spokesman. Really a bad idea because this was absolutely a crisis. They refused to communicate openly. They'd have major magazines contact them. They wouldn't respond. They tried to, have interviews, wouldn't respond. And instead of accepting responsibility, look, we didn't give our workers the necessary rest period that they deserved. Instead of taking care of the equipment on the Exxon Valdez, instead, the company decided to say, "You know what, it's really Alaska's fault. It's the Coast Guard's fault. They have failed to help us, and it's really their fault." Huge negative response to this. And for those of you going into media marketing, you'll learn much more about there is a point at which you have to accept the responsibility and then move on. And Exxon just kept failing to do anything correct. And in large part, remember, they refused to hire any kind of a single spokesperson and or a public relations firm, which they really needed to do. And what was the result? Well, after $3.8 billion in cleanup costs, they also had fines and other compensation that they had to pay out. They had $5 billion in punitive damages, but an appeals court later cut that in half. But still, 2.5 is no shoddy amount. They went from being the #1 oil company globally to the #3 company globally. They took a monstrous hit financially, and they lost major, major credibility in the eyes of the American public. I can remember that when this happened, I can remember at the time I was a teenager, but I can remember parents of my friends saying, "Well, I'm just not going to go get any, I'm not going to buy from an Exxon station. I'm not going to do that, anything that's associated," because they were so very, very angry at the failure of this corporation to respond in what they felt was a wise fashion because the environment had been impacted. Does that sound familiar? We had the Exxon Valdez in 1989, from which we could have learned major, major, major lessons about how companies can respond in the midst of a crisis, oil spill crisis. And what have we had? The BP oil spill. Now, you would have thought, remember we said we study communications because history repeats itself, not just history in the sense of war or history in the sense of how laws should be developed, but we can literally, we can study history of communication. BP could have looked back at the Exxon Valdez and seen the mistakes by the Exxon Valdez and could have chosen a route different than what they did choose. And quite frankly, many experts right now are saying that the BP response was in many respects very parallel, unfortunately, to what the Exxon response was. And you say, well, I'm not going to work for an oil company. How does that impact me? But again, look at the response, how the mass media was used in the BP situation. You've got some situations where there were kind of like town hall meetings around where the BP oil spilled and where people were just hugely impacted. They were losing their livelihood, they were losing their income. People who for years and years and years had fished were now saying, I don't have a dime, what can I do? Here's one town hall meeting in which one spokesperson discharged his secret weapon. So he's meeting with people and he uses statistics. Oh, why didn't they look back at the Exxon Valdez? And he said that there were about 100 miles of shoreline that had been affected by oil, of which 25 miles was amenable to cleaning. So hooray, hooray, he's stating. And then he says there are 226,000 barrels of oil that have been collected by skimmers out of a total of more than 6 million barrels that had been dispersed since the rig had exploded. And in his statistical barrage at them, he said that there were more than 679,000 feet of hard containment boom and a 540,000 foot of absorbent boom that had already been laid to block the oil from reaching the shore. So this man is just attempting to pummel these listeners with stats. And then he said, I hope you are impressed by these numbers. I certainly am. This has been the most extraordinary response I've ever seen. It's historic. I would not have expected this measure of success, and you should feel somewhat relieved by this. Now, understand that this statement was made prior to the total knowledge of whether or not the capping of this well was actually going to work. So can you imagine if you're sitting in that audience, you don't have an income, your life as you've known it has been completely turned upside down by a foreign company, in essence, and yet here stands a man spewing statistics at you saying, I think this is a most extraordinary response. It's historic. How do you think the people responded? They were not happy. They were not ecstatic. Most of the audience sat there stunned, and some gasped. Absolutely not a good response on the part of the BP Corporation. One individual who was assessing the communications, I'm not dealing with the oil. Remember, we're just interested in communications. So one individual who was assessing the communications by BP said, you know what? They lost the media war before the oil spill. You say, well, how could that happen? I mean, didn't this crisis bring it about? Well, according to this analyst, he said no, because the first thing BP and any company needs to do is to listen to the consumers. He felt that based upon research, he could assert that BP was, prior to the oil spill, that BP was not listening as well to its customers as it perhaps could have. This same individual went on to say that BP really missed the boat in that they were not, this is fascinating to me, they were not active in social media prior to the whole issue with that oil rig. He says they had 2 of the 4 profiles established, the 4 major being Flickr and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. but they had not really used them interactively with the consumers. And he said, you can't simply flip a switch like that and expect to get traction with an audience. In other words, after the crisis, BP starts going onto Facebook and BP starts flickering. And according to this communications analyst, that was too little too late. You've got to have your presence known ahead of the crisis, be out there so that if and when a crisis does occur, you are right there. Your people can go. You're not trying to create a web. You're not trying to create a blog. You already have that up and running. Fascinating. And I think what you need to realize is that in your era, uh, mass media is just constant. It is not something that will be created tomorrow. It is in motion and just exploding daily. Look at the number of new web pages daily. It's phenomenal. It is mind-boggling. It really is. So Forbes.com said, what if BP had turned to a coach instead of media experts and instead of lawyers? BP did try to bring in a few of the media experts this time. They did learn that lesson from the Valdez, but I don't think they really got their money's worth. And you know what Forbes said? Perhaps we should have gone to somebody like Lou Holtz, who's a very, very famous and very effective coach for Notre Dame. And Lou Holtz said, you know what people need to know? He said, I really think people need to know three things. When you're in leadership, they need three things. Number one, they want to know, do you care about me? As a person, do you care about me? When that man stood up with all those statistics that he could say to those people along the coastline, they weren't interested in the statistics. They could have cared less, quite frankly, about the number of gallons that have been swept up. I think what they needed to know was, is this company recognizing I am in pain? I am hurting. I am losing my life as I have known it and as my family perhaps has known it for generations. So number one, when you're thinking media and crisis, does that corporation care about me as a person? Not as a statistic, but as a person. Number two, can I trust you? Can I trust you as a person? Can I trust you as a leader? But, do you have that moral compass that allows me to really trust you? Finally, Lou Holtz said, are you, as a leader, committed to excellence? Because when you are committed to excellence, then you are going to surround yourself by others who are committed to excellence. And then, if and when a crisis hits, you've got that foundation built, and you are going to be able to deal with that crisis, even though it's challenging, in a strong way. All right, and there are just multitudes of examples of PR disasters. We're going to hit on just a couple more, okay? And then keep going. KFC made a mistake in 2009. Now, I am not necessarily a fan of Oprah Winfrey. She has an incredibly powerful show, I would say. I think we're all aware of the fact that, if she likes a book, boy, the next day, apparently, if you go into a bookstore, that book is flying off the shelf. I don't watch her. I have my reasons for not being a particular fan of her. I've just seen her take few too many liberal angles on things, and so for me, I don't watch her. But there is no question that as a media mogul, she is quite powerful. And in 2009, KFC was trying to roll out some new products, right? We know that they had lots and lots of grilled things, but now they were going to move on they had lots and lots of fried things. And in the era of health, people were saying, we want grilled things. And so they said, okay, we're going to do it. So what they did, if you look at this was a coupon online that Oprah Winfrey unveiled. And notice what it is. You've got a grilled chicken two-piece meal. I mean, this was quite a coupon. So you got the 2 pieces of chicken, and you got the biscuit and a side. I mean, this was really quite a nice coupon. The problem was KFC had a nice idea. They're trying to get this new product out to the public. And what better way than to give out some free coupons and let people go try it, fall in love with it, and then keep returning. The dilemma was how KFC, they put it on one of the most powerful shows on television. All right, I'll grant them that was a good idea. But as you look at all the research, not just what I think, but what the research analysts suggest was that KFC's major mistake was that they did not put a limitation upon this coupon. In other words, the coupon could have been open for only 1 hour, or the coupon could have been open only once to one individual. But apparently, what happened was it was up there for perhaps 24 hours. People were downloading it multiple times, and this is what the recognition was. That when the announcement was made, notice how you've kind of got, your how many times is her blog being hit, and then wow, what a jump. What a jump the day of the announcement, and how many times her blog is just skyrocketing. The dilemma was then most of the KFC stores were completely unprepared to be able to handle this kind of a rush. You have stores that, perhaps are only doing a couple $1,000s a day. Now you've got all these coupons, and those were worth more in, as far as the chicken and the products were concerned than these people typically did in perhaps a week. And so you had stores that had to send away people, you had disgruntled customers, you had KFC trying to send out rain checks. It was a complete disaster because they had not completely thought through the entire process from beginning to end. They had the idea of, hey, let's give out a free coupon. Good idea. But you have to think through all the ramifications and then get the big picture before you get your company into trouble. Bob Greenberg, who runs Madison Avenue's most creative interactive ad agency. You should go read up on him. Fascinating man. He's good at ads, okay? He's good at ads. He's worth around approximately $20 million. He worked for Microsoft, I believe it was, until about 1981, kind of ventured off on his own, and as just, multi-millionaire because of being able to do successful ads. And notice what he said. Ad agency executives cannot continue to just pitch the 30-second television spot to clients. It's not that TV and radio and magazines and newspapers are dead, but they're past their heyday. Ad agencies that don't find a new model to reach consumers are setting themselves up for extinction. Why do we study the history of mass comm? Because we have to understand how media is changing, and as media changes, so does the advertising, so does the PR work. We had a company here in town. We have several real estate agencies in Watertown. And I remember chatting with one of the agents once, and I was looking for a particular home, but I didn't see it on your website. And she said, oh no, I am not going to put my homes on websites because I want people to come talk to me. I want the one-on-one. And I thought, oh, but boy, you are losing customers, right? You got customers perhaps moving from out of town, customers who are searching from out of state. The internet is not your enemy. It's an ability to get your product out there. And she was bucking it, and I think her company, unfortunately, really paid for her unwillingness to think outside the box. Now, understand that when it comes to mass communication, it's not just businesses, though, anymore that are recognizing the need for public relations and the wisdom for public relations. Why do I say that? Well, obviously, you've got politicians. And unfortunately, as political scandals come about, you see politicians hiring PR firms. How about sports players? We've had some major ones as of late who were unfaithful to their spouses, and it hits the media in a major way. You've got the way that political candidates fundraise. Now you can just send a text and donate $5. Or you can Twitter somebody about a political campaign. How about governmental agencies? The IRS is trying to make itself look very friendly to the American people. And they're using some mass media techniques to try to change an image that has been created for them. But understand that mass media changes as all of these capabilities come about. Now, I'm not necessarily for all of these, but these are major movers and shakers in a way that they were not even 2 to 3 years ago. I mean, what an impact several of these have made upon our society. Now, You may not be familiar with this. If you're not, I would encourage you again to go ahead and go um, look it up, read about it online. It's an absolutely fascinating situation, but it's what they called the balloon boy hoax. The man on the right of your screen was the daddy to the little boy who's on the bottom corner, and the little boy's name was Falcon. The father's name was Richard Heeson, I believe is how you say his last name. And boy, most of America just kind of came to a dead grinding halt as the news began to say that there was this UFO type, um, inflatable aircraft that was carrying this tiny little 6-year-old boy. And it just floated for miles and miles and miles and miles. And the father was concerned and had called the police. And then the media became involved. And the media were there. And they were, right alongside the balloon. And can you see the child? I mean, this was just live airing feed. And thousands of Americans watched it. Once the balloon landed, do you recall? I have a vivid recollection of one of the men who had been driving in a truck kind of underneath the balloon, and the balloon finally landed just of its own ability, and the man went running out, and you just expected to see this small child delivered from this, you know, ship that the father had created and that perhaps the child had just scampered into. And yet when the man gets there, it's empty and there's no child. And then the police, where's the child? Where's the child? And lo and behold, they find the child kind of hidden. I believe he was like up in the garage. And it was just all the news. And so the next day, of course, all the major places are asking for interviews with this family. And then he gets an interview on Larry King Live. Now, I don't believe Larry King was actually the one doing the interview that evening. I believe there was a guest host. But the interviewer turned to the small child, Falcon, and said to Falcon, "Why didn't you say where you were? Couldn't you hear your parents calling for you? There's this major search." And most of America by now, here's this darling little 6-year-old, and you're thinking, "Oh, what a cutie," and "Oh, I'm so grateful he wasn't hurt," and "Oh, my word." And little Falcon turned to his parents and said, "Well, but you told me not to say anything because of the show." Ah, and little by little details start coming out. A few days later, a man who had been somewhat working with the father comes forward with a story saying he had contacted us about perhaps doing a reality show with his family. So now you kind of have a turn. You got a twist here, right? You have this man who's probably willing to do a reality show on this somewhat, eccentric family. And this is what the man says. He says, "The dad told me," all right, so this is the interviewer speaking and rehearsing what the dad said, that, quote, "We will modify a weather balloon so that it resembles a UFO." He's talking about what am I going to do in the future. "And we will electrically charge the skin of the craft. We're going to capture the footage on film, utilize the media as a means to which to make our presence known to the masses. This will not only provide us with incredible footage, but will also generate a tremendous amount of controversy among the public, as well as publicity within the mainstream media." So here's a dad who totally understands mass media and determines to create this situation. So the interviewer says, "Wow," this is what he apparently wrote in his journal, "Richard is using his children as pawns to facilitate a global media hoax that's going to give him enough publicity to temporarily attract A-list celebrity status and hopefully attract a network." He wanted the attraction in order for his family to be on a reality show. One man used his child, and obviously his child was not within that um, balloon, fortunately, but he understood the power of the mass media. Well, how does that impact us? Well, remember, in our field, we want to make generalizations about how people communicate, and then how those generalizations affect communication. Walter Lippmann. So here I need you to write this down. Back to our notes, okay? Walter Lippmann is the name that I need you to associate with mass comm. And he was a major theorist and discussing how mass comm would impact society in the future. Alrighty? Because he was on the cutting edge. He had a couple assertions. One was he said the media are our eyes to the world beyond our reach. I think there's great truth to that. The media are our eyes to the world beyond our reach. If I'm in Watertown, Wisconsin right now, I don't know what's going on in I don't know what's going on in Orlando, Florida. I don't know what's going on in Nuremberg, Germany. The media, though, can help me. It can be my eyes. Next, Walter Lippmann asserted that the media accounts of the world beyond my experience. Okay, so what the media tells me is actually going on out there plays an important role in defining my attitude and my actions. Right? So write that down. That the media accounts of the world, the media accounts of what's going on out there beyond my experience, plays a huge role in defining my attitudes and my actions. You say, oh, no, Mrs. Morris, I don't think that's true. Really. Think about the media coverage of the war in Iraq up until the election. We were basically pummeled, were we not? I mean, daily, how many lives have been lost? And listen, every life is very, very valuable. But can I ask you, since the election, how much have you heard about the war in Iraq, quite frankly? It literally, overnight, changed on a dime the amount of coverage. Interesting. Interesting what the media chose to tell us as important. Okay, think it through again. That the media accounts of the world beyond my experience plays an important role in defining my attitudes and my actions. So, how the media covers Germany, how the media covers Poland, how the media covers England, how the media covers Spain might perhaps impact what I think of those different countries and what's actually going on, perhaps in their crises. Now, what are some things that we can know about concerns that we might have about the mass media, as Walter Lippmann would say to us. All right, so these were a couple of his concerns. First of all is what's known as the pseudo environment. So you've got this on your notes. Go ahead and give me a definition here. Pseudo obviously means false, right? So a false environment. This is a society that cannot distinguish between what's real and what's manipulated by a public relations strategist, cannot determine between what is real and what is packaged by a journalist. Okay? It's a pseudo environment created, or Walter Lippmann, who was way ahead of his time, said, will we create a pseudo environment where people just cannot distinguish between what's real and what is just manipulated? And you say, well, Mrs. Morris, that would never happen. I just am too smart. I'm a college student. I'm a thinker, and good for you. Keep being a thinker, but can I ask you, were you ever fooled by this man, Bear Grylls? And for those of you who ever watched his show, he was known as quite the survivor. He'd be found in these treacherous situations and always managed to work his way out. And he'd be tired and exhausted and hungry until one of the workers, it was either a cameraman or a journalist or someone, came forward, somehow upset at the producer, and said, look, Bear Grylls will have this trek for a few miles, but he stays in a hotel, and people pre-make his situations, and they make sure that it's going to go right. So the question is, how many people were deceived into believing that pseudo environment? So now, watch that show. There's a little disclaimer at the beginning saying, there might be some help ahead of time on these situations. So they're fessing up to the help, but they're going on with the adventure. Lippmann's next concern was the magic bullet, what he called the magic bullet, the hypodermic needle. And his concern was that the media could have a direct, immediate, powerful effect. And he really thought that all three of those, it would be direct, it would be immediate, and it would be powerful. And you say, well, that can't happen. Well, we did see it happen with War of the Worlds. And I do think that, as I'm going to show you a couple more examples, it can have quite a powerful effect on the viewer. So I would say that Lippmann might have had too big of a concern, all right? It may not be as immediate as he thought, but I think there's no question that it can have a the media can have a major impact and a powerful impact as well. Now, some of the lessons, though, that we can learn, the 3 lessons I want you to write down. One is what is known in communications as the limited effects theory. Limited effects. That just asserts that the media, yes, it's powerful, but its influences are really based on race, on age, on gender, on specific aspects of the audience itself. Okay, so the limited effect says, yes, the media can have power, but it's really going to be based on rage and race and age, oh boy, and gender. Okay, you're probably all familiar with these ads between the PC and the Mac. And, as you have to learn to be analyzers of ads. I enjoy watching ads, and then I'll sit there and think, who's the target audience? And I think there's no question in this that it is for a younger generation. I'm not talking 12-year-olds. But I don't know that this PC and via the Mac is necessarily for senior citizens. And learn that limited effects theory is what impacts those of you who are going to go into any kind of a media marketing. What ads go in what magazines? What ads are placed on what websites? That is all scientific and absolutely fascinating research that can be done. Next is what's known as the framing analysis. Just think of a picture frame, okay? The framing analysis. Trying to get you there you go, there's a straight frame. That the media power is limited, again, based on what we have learned through social cues. Okay? In other words, the social cues that we grow up with frame our reality. And these frames we often see through the lens of a media. All right, so the media, in essence, says, here's reality, here's your frame, now make your decision. That's what's called framing analysis. Let me give you an example in case that's not making any sense to you. A lot of times if you watch a football game or the Super Bowl or baseball games, you will see lots and lots and lots of ads for cars, correct? Because the media, though it is powerful, we have all these social cues, right, that are framing our sense of reality. And the frame of our media says, you got to have the bigger car and the nicer car and the faster car. And it's all about the cars. And my son was once teasing me because he was saying, Mom, you don't spend a lot of money on cars. And I said, you know what? Cars rust. I just need a car that is going to get me from point A to point B, and it doesn't have to be a Maserati or a Lamborghini, alrighty? Now, what made a major impact on that? Because when I went on a missions trip to Africa, and these people in the middle of the jungle were literally existing, if I were to take them a picture and show them a car, say, do you think you need this? Well, these people are in the jungle. They have no need for a car. Do you understand? That's how the media, what they tell us, is limited based on the social cue. Because people in the middle of the jungle in Africa don't need a car. They need food. Okay? They need education first. Finally, you've got the media dependency, the media system dependency. And that's that. That theory, that lesson, is that sometimes when we cannot get that information, we become excessively dependent on the media. Okay? Just like a child is dependent upon a parent to pay the bills, or a child is dependent on the parent to take him or her to baseball practice, in the little leagues. The media dependency is the greatest when people cannot depend on personal sources of information. All right? What about Hurricane Katrina? I wasn't there. I couldn't call a friend. And so I was very dependent on the media. What were they going to tell me? Do you remember where you were in 9/11? I can, and I can remember just being glued to the television because I was very dependent on it because I had no way of getting that information on my own. So that's the media dependency system. And so I just want to leave you with this. How much do you Really rely on the media to shape your attitudes, to shape your idea, to shape your actions. And I would encourage you, as long as it's grounded in truth, grounded in respect, grounded in a moral compass of that which is right, then certainly we can look at and we can learn from the media. But we have to be very, very, very careful because there are a lot of people out there without the same moral compass that we may have, trying to fill our minds with various things. And we have to learn to filter everything that we take in through the sieve of Scripture, recognizing that the mass media has a very, very powerful impact on our society. Alrighty, that's it for today. Have a good and godly day. What lasting value is a good day if it's not also godly? We'll see you.